Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Noel Carolan. Noel is a local history and family history enthusiast who's due to complete a history PhD at Dublin City University in the coming months. He is researching the politics of food supply in Ireland during peace and war from 1895 to 1923. Noel's PhD research is funded by DCU, the Universities Ireland History Bursary, and the Irish Research Council. He has presented talks on dozens of local history groups and delivered papers at academic conferences in Ireland, Northern Ireland, Britain, and Czechia. And Noel initially got in contact with us a number of months ago because he had come across an article written by Johnny Burke in one of our newsletters. And that was what convinced him to come to us to deliver this lecture tonight. So we're delighted to have you and very honoured that you chose us. So without any further ado, if you'd all give Noel a welcome.
That's great, Irene. Thanks very much. Thank you. Now, there are, because it's being recorded, a few housekeeping things that I have to do at the beginning, and that is I need to acknowledge the funding for the research that I'm doing. So my research is funded by DCU, the Universities Ireland, and the Irish Research Council. And my research into the 1922 and 25 food supply crisis presented here is funded by the Decade of Centenaries Bursary from the Royal Irish Academy. And as Irene suggested, there is a reason why I'm here. And the reason essentially is that when I was going through information on the 1925 food supply crisis, I came across this piece that was done here by Johnny Burke. And that's really why I got in touch with the Society. And it all kind of more or less went along from there. So this is basically a three-part type of talk. It begins with the Starving West photography of the 1898 food supply crisis and, significantly, attempts the first measurement of hunger across Galway, and I'll show that to you in a few minutes. It then moves to the 1922 food supply crisis and the so-called famine of that year in Connemara. That's depicted here in a Sunday Independent drawing in February 1922. The last part of the presentation deals with the claims in the American, British, and Soviet press about 750,000 starving peasants in the west of Ireland. But it also includes a good number of photographs and reportage from County Galway. So, this is a potato market on the other side of the country in Drogheda in 1898. It was published anyhow in 1898. Potatoes were still an important element of all three food supply crises that I'm looking at here this evening with you. Note, I suppose, 3 points about this photograph worth looking at. First of all, most of the people, if not all of the people here, are women. Second of all, most of us here of a certain age even know this, of course, potatoes were transported in sacks, in heavy-duty Hessian sacks, and you can see them pointed out there by arrows. And third, just the point about that weighing balance or the weighing scales, how significantly large it was, because it also features later on in the talk. Now, this is the only set of bullet points I have, but it's kind of necessary because episodic food supply crises continued in Ireland after the Great Famine, and they ended actually in 1925. They occurred along Ireland's isolated Atlantic coast, where potato-centric subsistence diets and uneconomic smallholdings and reliance on summertime labour migration endured. Typically, families were large, and there was a persistent lack of local employment. Welfare provision was rudimentary by today's standards. It was provided indoors in the workhouse, and outdoor relief was tightly restricted outdoors on a means test. There was in 1898 even no old age pension came in 1909. So the Starving West photography all arose in the spring of 1898. The photography was commissioned by and published in the Irish Field magazine that's still around. a sporting magazine between March and May 1898. It was a very unusual departure for such a magazine, given its exclusive focus on sports, such as horse racing, yachting, fishing, shooting, cycling, and that enduring sport that was just around the corner in 1898, motoring. The owner and editor was Frederick Fraper McCabe, and he was a doctor by profession. He travelled to Connemara in March 1898, accompanied by a photographer whose name I cannot get to be any further than D. Lennon. I don't know what his first name was, from the Lafayette firm of studio in Sackville Street in Dublin, preeminent photographers of the day. McCabe wrote most, if not all, of approximately 13,000 words presented in 6 Irish Field articles from the 5th of March to the 28th of May, under a Starving West title, and illustrated significantly by 23 photographs. In April, McCabe informed his readers that he had not gone to Connemara prepared to get photographs of people inside their cabins, and he expressly promised readers that a return visit by his photographer would do so. The photographer returned, and he produced more photographs and also left an account of his efforts to get them. This then was the first of the indoor photographs promised by McCabe. It was, as you can see, heavily staged. None of the characters here is in a pose that you would say was almost normal. He used it as his title photograph for the remaining of the Irish Field articles, emblazoned with his Starving West artwork. That's exactly how it appears in the magazine. The involvement of the preeminent Lafayette firm undoubtedly provided the technical capacity for indoor photography in dark cabins such as that shown here, because there has been an element of doubt about this. In early 1865, for example, Mr. Chancellor, another photographer from Sackville Street in Dublin, used magnesium light in the rotunda to illuminate his subjects. So more than 30 years of photographic technological advances had unfolded before these photographs were taken in the remote and indeed dark cabins in Connemara. It's important to point out as well from the reportage, these are not the stone buildings, the remains of which we see today in Connemara. These were shacks and temporary places. The poorest of the poor are who were living in these circumstances. So you wouldn't see what was left of what they were living in years after, now talk of decades in this instance. In 1898, Lafayette, its photographer, the Irish Field, and as we'll see later, the Lord Mayor of Dublin, could all ill afford the reputational damage sure to accompany any indication that the photographs were taken elsewhere. I am satisfied they were taken in those cabins. So, this carefully composed image appeared in McCabe's final article on the 28th of May. Writing from Garumna Island to Irish-American readers of the Irish World newspaper on the 3rd of May, Father Edward Lavelle, a priest on the island, expected to give American benefactors, quote, some photographs of these poor, hungry children. As he said, we have on the island a Dublin photographer. Most likely that photographer was Lennon. That is when he was there. McCabe detailed many distressing cases of hunger, and he evocatively titled photographs such as asking for food, begging for warmth, and in search of food. He underpinned the integrity of his reports and photographs with an offer to provide names and addresses to corroborate his claims. He claimed that the worst case was a starved-looking man, his wife and 9 children, all living in a hut that was not big enough to stable an average-sized horse. Bear in mind who the readers are. This means something to them. Although it's very interesting that they're even finding out anything about this at all in such a magazine. This family in this photograph received 3 shillings a week on outdoor relief, the social welfare system in operation at the time. Titled Their Only Hope. This is the only known photograph of the distribution of charitable relief in relation to a food supply issue. In this case, a priest distributes what has been received from the Dublin Lord Mayor's Relief Fund and the Manchester Relief Fund. Significantly, it appears the priest is giving the relief to women. Men unusually are standing at the back of this queue. This is a society and a place in which you can be certain women were standing at the back of absolutely everything. But in this particular instance, it was slightly different. This, however, was by far the most iconic, shocking, and persuasive photograph created by McCabe and Lennon. McCabe gave it to the Dublin Lord Mayor for use in his humanitarian effort. The prospect of women working, carrying heavy stones, the men are actually sitting down. The men look as if they're leisurely employed, cracking a few stones, while the women carry all the heavy stones. It's a fabulous piece of photography as well as everything else. The Irish Field printed a series of fundraising leaflets for the Dublin Lord Mayor, such as that shown here. The photographs of the 1898 food supply crisis made their way across the Irish Sea to London, where they were published in The Sketch. The Sketch was a prominent weekly journal featuring the photography of high society and the arts, and it was from the stable of the Illustrated London News, which was where we saw all of those engravings about the Great Famine that were so influential half a century earlier. Now note here in the Sketch photographs, note the extraordinary extent to which facial images were changed in the Sketch, outlined in red, as compared to their original appearance in the Dublin Lord Mayor's versions, which are in yellow. What does it tell us? That the manipulation of photographs in 1898 was capable of doing much of what we would see today. This photograph is also in the Sketch, and it was taken by James Long, the Manchester Guardian correspondent who reported extensively from the west of Ireland in 1898. Thousands of words of reportage, and I think reliable stuff too, in fairness. However, Long and others have provided considerable detail on the photography of the 1898 food supply crisis, and crucially too, the attitude of people to their being photographed. This was not a regular set of photographs. So the Dublin Lord Mayor provided copies of 5 different humanitarian leaflets that he had to the National Library under heading of a letter which I have seen on the 10th of June, 1898. And the National Library also holds the report of the Mansion House Fundraising Committee, which he headed, which includes the Irish Field fundraising photographs. And that report, and the photographs in it, was the basis of one of 6 episodes in a remarkably innovative and accomplished television documentary format called Trína Linsa, Through the Lens, which translates as Through the Lens. 3 series have been made to date, providing fascinating insights into early Irish photography, photographic collections, and the associated socioeconomic contexts. The episode titled Cruachas a Connemara, translates as Distress in Connemara, was first broadcast in November 2015. But the television programme didn't explore anything around the Irish Field, the publication of them, the reportage. They didn't mention any of that. So I don't know whether they knew about it or not, but it didn't feature in the programme anyway. So having discovered the 1898 reportage of photography, I approached the Irish Field, and they were happy to publish a short article on the photographs way back in June 2021. And if you look at the RTE Brainstorm website, you'll find there two articles really that I've done in relation to the 1898 crisis photography and also that in 1925. But we do need to stay for the minute with 1898. So we need to take a look at the welfare system that I mentioned in 1898. And indeed, in Galway, we have two photographs here that are kind of useful in terms of giving an understanding to various aspects of that system. So first of all, the outdoor relief photograph that was seen earlier with the person who was getting family who was getting 3 shillings a week is useful to keep in mind as the example of who the people were who were the recipients of outdoor relief. Indoor relief was provided in the workhouse, as the photograph on the right-hand side shows. And in this case, it's the women's dormitory, or the women's dormitory rather, in Portumna Workhouse in the east of Galway, which indeed all of you I'm sure know about. And the dormitory has been restored in what is now the Irish Workhouse Centre, and it's open to the public and something that is really well worth a visit. The point about it is, if you looked at it from the air, it looks like this. This is what the complex looks like. And Portumna Poor Law Union is shown here on this map in the east of County Galway, and the workhouse, in fact, is reasonably close to the River Shannon as it happens. Importantly, however, here we can see that outdoor relief in Portumna fell from 104 persons in 1897 to just 85 in 1898, despite the fact that there was a food supply crisis in many places. Now, various reasons can be identified for this, and I'm just not going to look at them at the moment. One of them, however, is the fact that Portumna was not one of the 11 unions where poor law relief works were established in 1898. So 11 poor law unions in 1898 had relief works. And you can see here then in terms of where Annadown was. So Annadown more or less straddles two poor law unions, Tuam, which had no relief works, that's in white, and Galway, where relief works did commence in 1898. There's insufficient time here now to explain the mathematical analysis, which allows the combination of persons on outdoor relief and persons on relief works into a single variable, which I identify as unified relief. And similarly, it isn't possible here to show the strong positive correlation that there is between monthly wholesale prices of potatoes as an indicator of supply and the monthly movement of people on unified relief. Put simply though, changes in unified relief are an effective proxy measure of changes in the food supply. So with that in mind, the point is, when you look at 1897, that should be, and 98, in 1898, there were 43 unions where unified relief actually fell. And we know already that Portumna is one of those. And crucially, look where they were. Most are in the eastern part of the country. Increases of up to 24% are shown here in green, and most are still in the eastern half of the country. Increases of 25 to 49% still had a broadly eastern bias to them. Though small in number, those increases with increases between 50% and 74%, they're more centrally located. And even fewer unions had increases between 75% and 99%. But pretty much you can guess at this stage, significantly, those with 100% or more had a definite Western location. But it's important to point out here that many were very substantially over 100%. This is 100% and over. So at this point, it's useful to look at Galway and see what was happening in Galway. So once again, Annadown is here between the two unions, Tuam and Galway. Now, union boundaries often crossed, as you know, county boundaries. And some of these look a little bit inaccurate here because these are all drawn by hand. and I went around the borders of the lakes rather than through them. So they're a little bit wobbly, so to speak, on some of the borders around the lakes, but pretty much that is what they look like geographically. What's the big deal? So here we see the grey ones, the ones where the unified relief fell. Look first at Portumna. Not surprisingly, given our earlier chart with a decrease of 18%. And decreases occurred in the neighbouring unions of Ballinasloe and Loughrea. Increases between 3% and 138% occurred in 4 unions, in Glenamaddy, Mountbellew, Gort and Tuam. More than a 3-fold increase happened in Galway Union. Dramatically, the factor of the increase in Uachtarard was in the region of 9 times. It was 9 times higher than it had been the previous year, all of which was less than what happened in Clifton. It was higher still, 1,077% higher, almost by a factor of 11. So that brings us then to the 1922 food supply crisis. So, in the spring of 1922, the Irish White Cross estimated that approximately 100,000 persons on the western seaboard faced starvation. Although the organization principally directed its American financial aid at War of Independence destruction. Despite the peaceful winter of 1921-2, the food supply worsened considerably. By August 1922, the Irish White Cross had allocated £20,000 for the barest necessities of life, food, clothing, and seed potatoes principally. By February, the food supply crisis was characterized as famine, and seen here in the Sunday Independent drawing, which called for relief in Connemara. An Irish Independent special representative toured Connemara and provided detailed reports under the headline, "Dread Story of Famine, Ghastly State of Connemara." It detailed living conditions and food shortages remarkably like those of 1898, and recounted how people in 1922 existed, quote, on 2 meals of potatoes that elsewhere would not be fed to pigs. In early March 1922, Father Godfrey, a Catholic priest at Letterfrack in County Galway, wrote to the provisional government complaining that most of the people had no potatoes since Christmas. Father Godfrey asked the government of just 6 weeks' existence, with striking clarity, what can your government do in helping to supply seed potatoes and oats? Maud Gunn, the veteran publicist of the 1898 food supply crisis in Ireland, France, and America, travelled to Donegal with Charlotte Despard, where they found famine conditions prevailing in some districts. They called on the provisional government to issue a loan of £200,000 for the purpose of, they said, saving the West from famine. Government assistance was afoot following Dáil approval for a £100,000 grant to relieve, in the words of its local government minister, W.T. Cosgrave, he called it economic distress of the most pronounced order, approaching famine in some areas. A remarkable statement. There was surprisingly little coverage of the 1922 food supply crisis in North American papers. This New York Herald front page article on Michael Collins in 1922 mentions it nonetheless. As the headline indicates, there was a considerable interest in Michael Collins and his clothing. But the headline includes, famine in Connemara reappears and 8,000 persons are destitute. It reports the worst famine in living memory, which was a very unlikely claim, given that octogenarians at least, and those older, could remember the Great Famine then. However, the report noted the humanitarian work of Thomas Casement, who was the brother of Roger Casement, and Roger had done a lot of work in 1913 and 14 with school meals in Connemara. A few months earlier, there was considerable interest in America in Michael Collins, and a journalist called Milton Bronner claimed that he was the first to interview Collins in late October 1921 in London. Bronner was the London correspondent of the San Francisco-based Newspaper Enterprise Association, syndicating news and content to more than 400 American newspapers, papers in Canada and the US. Seen here is a much later photograph of Bronner, who played an extraordinary role in the 1925 food supply crisis when he travelled throughout Galway and publicised the crisis in the United States and in Canada. And we now turn to that crisis of 1925. By early December, the Irish Free State government was already laying plans for an unprecedented series of relief works in 23 of the 26 counties of the state. The economy was in an absolutely disastrous situation. The old age pension had been reduced by 10%. There was a considerable amount of major problems with the economy. Almost £500,000 was committed to relief in this programme. On the 29th of January, the editor of the New York World newspaper, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, whose journalism prize endures today, sent an urgent cablegram to W.T. Cosgrave, now the head of the Irish Free State government. The editor pressed Cosgrave to address American reports of widespread famine in the west of Ireland, with many dying and freezing because of lack of fuel. A few days later, a cablegram from John D. Voy's Gaelic American newspaper asked Cosgrave to indicate what Irish America could do in response. Astonishingly, the ever-sympathetic Manchester Guardian newspaper published a photograph from the 1898 food supply crisis, which it represented as a contemporary record in 1925. An extraordinary thing for a newspaper of the quality and character that the Manchester Guardian, in fairness, was then and still is. But it did happen. From the Lord Mayor's Mansion House Photograph Fund collection, it was also the principal image that was examined in the Tread and Lindsay documentary. It was one of the most significant photographs, as you can see, in the way it was posed. And so we're back to Milton Bronner, who visited Galway in February 1925, accompanied by, guess what, a photographer, so that he could produce 3 articles for syndication to News Enterprise Association outlets to hundreds of newspapers across the United States and Canada. His first article made its way to Dublin via Professor Timothy Aloysius Smithy. Who was he? He was Ireland's first envoy to Washington, in place at this stage for just 6 months. Remarkable man, remarkable career, and extraordinary that Ireland was able to have an envoy at that particular time, because remember, of course, Ireland is a dominion. However, don't have time for that. A copy remains on file in the National Archives of Ireland at the reference shown here. Now, I know you can't quite see it from where you are, but nonetheless, either side of that red arrow, you can see the date stamp in Washington and the word president in handwriting, indicating that it was forwarded to W.T. Cosgrave, who was president of the Executive Council or government. And for overseas viewers, I suppose, the equivalent is today's Taoiseach or Prime Minister of today. Bronner's heading to his first 3 articles was certainly eye-catching. Irish famine story at first hand. Simple, dramatic title, but it had a rather long subtitle. I'll come to it in a moment. Headings and subtitles were changed in many versions of Bronner's articles that were published across America, but the material itself, the articles stayed together as they were. Bronner attributes his subtitle to a woman with 8 children whose husband was away on a farm working. Bronner spells her name phonetically for the American audience. She was Mrs. Keneally. She was married to Bartle Keneally, who was the man who was away on the farm. He was 45 years old. She told him that the previous year's weather ensured that there was, in what became the words of the subtitle, no food for the pot, no turf for the fire, while the black rain washed potatoes from the ground and the wee children were crying. That is what Bronner recorded. Significantly, though, this photograph here was not Mrs. Keneally or her home. The caption on the photograph says that it is the type of one-room hovel set on a barren rocks in the congested west coast where the potato and turf shortage is most keenly felt. Standing in front of the house are Mrs. Kate Joyce, not an easy name to research in Galway, and 2 of her children, all barefooted. And we don't even know what part of Galway she was in, but even so, presumably no, the house was similar to Mrs. Keneally's, which Bronner described as measuring 20 feet by 10 feet, and for people who are younger than me, 6 meters by 3 meters. The door stood open to allow light penetrate the darkness. The whole family resided there, including the chickens, Bronner said, when they had them. The dog and the pig lived in this shelter, according to Bronner. Bronner was invited in, and he found a fire comprising just 2 pieces of turf. He described children, Michael and Thomas, aged 2 and 3 years. He said, huddling against each other in vain search of a little warmth. Over Connemara way, Mrs. Keneally said, people are worse off. Their fires are out. So at least we know that Mrs. Keneally seems not to have lived in Connemara, so she wasn't in Connemara wherever she lived. Bronner described how 6,000 tons of coal were being shipped by the government to places where there is a peat shortage. Seed potatoes were being distributed by the government for the next crop, and 18,000 school children were given daily meals of bread, margarine, and cocoa. I've seen the recipe. They would not have got fat on it. There was no likelihood of it, but it was important nonetheless. Bronner spoke to, quote, many parish priests up and down the coast, and cited their message to America as follows. Send us shoes. Our government is taking care of the people as regards food and fuel. That's what Bronner recorded. But this closely cropped, compelling image of an unrelated child to the people we've looked at, looking straight into the camera, became the favorite and most frequently published American newspaper photograph from Bronner's series. Bronner's evocative claim in the caption undoubtedly secured its popularity. The caption was, the woes of the whole west of Ireland famine region are written in the face of this sad and frightened little boy found near Galway. Such mingling of carefully chosen visual and written imagery delivered a very potent journalistic unison. This is fabulous journalism. Note on the photograph, down in the bottom corner, the SEA mark. The mark on the photograph indicating that the syndication company owns it. A reminder as much as the fact that it was owned by them as the fact that it was likely to be well publicized around the place. And indeed, it was. And here is an example of that circulation from the Victoria Daily Times in Canada and the Cumberland Evening Times in Maryland, a few days apart in February 1925. But these Bronner articles crisscrossed the North American continent over several weeks. Bronner travelled from Galway City to the Aran Islands on the Dunaingus steamship, a journey, he said, of around 30 miles but which took 4 hours in the teeth of the gale then blowing. The steamship was loaded with coal, few pigs, and flour. Inishmore, the largest island, had a pier, and the ship was met there by several hundred men and women. The parish priest, Father Welch, informed Bronner that the coal delivery would save lives. The priest explained how the yield of potatoes had been unusually poor on the island, and how foreign steam trawlers had depleted local fish stocks over the previous years. Bronner described how the priest endorsed the importance of emigrant remittances from America. He said, "American money means a sack of flour occasionally. It means coal when turf is not to be had. In the present bad times, it means potatoes and bread and tea. Meat for ordinary uses is a luxury. So is milk, so are eggs and jam," he said. The accompanying photograph for this Aran Islands article of a woman and 5 children lined up in the front of her doorway, or a doorway at least, was of course undoubtedly staged. People do not stand like that outside their house then, now, or any other time. But an understandable error occurred with the photograph. It depicted a family from Lettermullen Island, an island several mile distance from the Aran Islands. Nonetheless, its caption here, and those captions consistently were published in all of the versions, was that it was a mother and 5 barefooted children in front of their Lettermullen cabin. None of the family is named. It is worth remembering that given the apparent ages of the children, they must, several of them, have lived far into the 20th century and were likely known to people who are middle-aged today or a little more. However, Bronner included a photograph of an elderly named Lettermore couple, and it circulated widely under a variety of different headings. The Washington example on the left refers to pair on isle near end of tether, children here their only hope, children in America that is. While that on the right in New Jersey is headed, thousands of famine-stricken Irish kept alive by American donations. It is important to emphasize that while Bronner's texts and photographic captions remained intact, local newspaper editors amended or replaced entirely the headings that were used by Bronner and his NEA service. So, some further examples are shown here for the named Lettermullen couple in this article. Resonant themes throughout more headings than are shown here included references to elderly people being lonely, dependence on emigrant remittances, facing famine, dearth of food, or even death itself. So to look at the article. A final example of that article from Wisconsin, where the article was headed, "Lonely Old Folk Face Irish Dearth in Country God Forgot," which is quite a heading, no matter what way you look at it. However, the caption throughout the reportage indicated that the photograph was that of John Lee, Agnes Lee, his wife, and a little neighbour girl who wasn't named. And they were described as Irish peasants on Lettermullen Island in the famine region. Bronner opens his article with a quotation attributed to John, saying, "It's the lonesome old people we are now surely, and we are walking down quietly to the grave. Our strong sons all across the water, and their sons know nothing of us at all. But talk, which is like dreams. And we here in the black bitter wind and stillness of the night are thinking of past days." They may have been his words exactly, or they may not, but they are powerful words. This is the first time I've read them aloud. Those words were written 99 and a half years ago. There's a poignance about it, regardless of whether they were his exact words or whether they were formed into what is written there. Bronner described their clothing in a level of detail probably best left for you to read for yourself. He tells us that John has always raised his own potatoes, but this year he has almost none. Bronner tells us that Agnes and her husband John have sons in Boston and Chicago. More positively, last Christmas, the sons in America sent money which eased the path for Agnes and John. And so, to bring Milton Bronner's photographs to a close, this slide shows how some other newspapers used the photographs. They were used as fillers, generally complete with the original captions, but with new headings. Examples such as these shown here were pushed in alongside the photographs of athletes and dignitaries and fashion people and politicians and newlyweds. And in the case of one on the left, and if this was a novel, it might even seem improbable, a photograph of Leon Trotsky going into exile in the Caucasus. That's where you could end up with your photographs. So, coverage of the so-called Irish famine was extensive in America. Syndicated reports ensured far-flung circulation and highly emotive headlines by local editors to ensure their purchased content was read. They had to buy this, so you can be certain they were going to put a heading on it to make it look like something that would sell. In just one day alone, and this is just one day, the 30th of January, and this is only one article on one day. In dozens of newspapers, George MacDonagh's article appeared, and he informed his readers that, quote, many people have already died of hunger amid a food and fuel shortage caused by incessant rain. He described Connemara families huddled desperately together for warmth, starving in their tumbled cottages, while distress was acute in County Kerry. That article had among its headings these headings. These were vivid headings from places as far apart as Tennessee, Illinois, Pennsylvania, California, and Texas, and they included many Irish slowly die of starvation, thousands of Irish slowly dying now, Irish famine zone worse than those of Black Year of 1847, suffering as bad as 1847, and famine grips Ireland as potato crop fails. These are not happening in the dozens, they're happening in the hundreds. Many days, day after day. This is why the telegrams came to the government, or the cablegrams as they were referred to then. For overseas viewers, anti-treaty Republicans refused to recognise the authority of the Irish Free State for a range of reasons that we don't have time to explore here. And they had their own food relief operations in the west of Ireland. In the middle here, Sean Theo Kelly advanced their cause in America, where he actually provided the role for the Republicans, similar to the role that Smitty provided for the government. And they both publicised, in fairness, the fact that this was not like 1847. Very significantly, Republican leader Eamon de Valera agreed with Cosgrave that conditions did not amount to famine. Mary McSweeney, then in America on a series of tours across America, reiterated that call. The fact that this is not 1847 or anything like it. There is serious distress. And the Republicans were, of course, saying there is serious distress and the Free State government isn't doing near enough about it. That's a different issue. They were at least agreed that it was not anything like famine. But the most emphatic and initially the most persuasive point and view came from Archbishop O'Donnell, soon to be Cardinal. He was a bishop as far back as 1898. His star is rising politically. He becomes Cardinal by the end of the year. What did he do? The North American newspapers publicized extensively a cablegram that O'Donnell ensured was going to be in the public domain of gratitude to Cardinal Hayes in New York for Hayes's gift of $25,000 for the relief of distress in Ireland. Relief of distress is the term. Distress is the term, not famine. You get the point? Distress is what it must be called officially. What's the big deal? The Archbishop says, there is no famine, says the message of the primate. But there is much want in places where incessant rains have melted the turf and almost destroyed the potatoes. Any money sent will be very useful. But there is no need thus far for any wide appeal to ever generous America. The political consequences of the Archbishop taking that position and publicizing it that was crucial to a government that was struggling to convince America that there was not famine in Ireland. So, a crucially important point arises here. How many people died? This is where it all really matters. Well, very significantly, recorded deaths in 1925 fell. There were fewer. They fell by 1,530, or 3.4%, when compared to those recorded in 1924. That's hugely, hugely significant. What is the likelihood that thousands or hundreds of deaths were being concealed? Pretty remote, really. More importantly, when we look at County Galway, in which Connemara is clearly, what happened there? Of even greater importance, there was almost no change in the number of recorded deaths in 1925 in County Galway. They increased by just 11 over the previous year. So there was good reason to heed the government position that there was no famine. The government position could be summarized in 4 views or images, and here they are. First, that the people were able to secure seed potatoes to provide adequate food later in 1925 and into the first half of the following year. Second, that the government was deeply involved in the provision of such seed potatoes, a point emphasized in this photograph by the presence of a rather stern-looking Garda in the background. For overseas viewers, the Garda was an unarmed officer of Ireland's police service. The woman appears to be signing a receipt for what she may have received. Third, the government is organising the distribution of seed potatoes. The man in the top right-hand corner of the image is standing on a large pile of sacks of seed potatoes. And finally, these men are working on the relief works, of which there are an extensive number around the country. So the point essentially is, if the government position was to be summarised in 4 lines, it might be summarised actually in those. What's the point about those lines? Well, those lines were the summary in a newsreel that started with those very words. And we need to start it now so that we can see it. So it's beginning to move. And on the next frame, you'll see the text that indicates that there's a need for industry in the area because largely that's always the solution as such. And this couple are walking along a road which seems to have had a very, very wet day or 2 or 3 or even more. However, here we can see 2 men inspecting the seed potatoes. Perhaps the man with the pipe had something to do with their distribution. It's not clear. Sorry. This time I won't let it happen again. We'll show it in one move and there won't be a problem. So we get to the start here again, and you see the people coming along the very wet road. And when we get them along the very wet road, then you get the person who's actually inspecting them here, who I think may have something to do with being an inspector or involved in the distribution of them. And when that point is moved on, we will see in a moment the photograph. You see the guard in the background, and the sacks are being loaded here onto this donkey and cart. And at some point when some of them are loaded, we will actually see the woman going up to the person who's distributing them, and she appears to sign for the potato seed that she has got. Strikingly, the only woman seen here. These are all men and boys. This is a male place. Men are looking at the potatoes and all that type of thing. And you can see here the weighing scales. Look how big it is in comparison to the people. And also we can see coming into the middle of the image now, the man standing on the bags of potatoes. These are bags of seed potatoes. It would seem that it seems indeed it was a very windy day. This is in the first 2 weeks, sometime in the first 2 weeks in February 1925. So these landscape views in a moment will move on to where potatoes were grown. And you will see shortly the extent to which there is such a clear depiction of the poor soil circumstances and the extent to which there are so many rocks in it. And you can see the outline of the furrows between the ridges, features that are often visible years after cultivation if land was left undisturbed when the ridges were opened and the potatoes were taken from them. Now, the Irish Film Institute, this was made by Pathé, British Pathé, a newsread film. And the Irish Film Institute restored it, and they did a remarkable service in their improvement of the quality of the film. And it's made freely available on the Irish Film Institute archive. And if you look up IFI archive, you get loads of particularly decade of centenaries films. And this one has been on the rounds for years, but nobody has really connected it to what actually was happening at the time. The IFI tell you on their website helpfully, they cite the hardship endured by Connemara people following the recession in the economy, and they explain some of the context of it, but it's not related specifically to the food supply crisis. And here you see the men employed building the road on the works. So today, the full context of the film is revealed here. It is a previously unidentified and invaluable visual artifact of the 1925 food supply crisis. Moreover, it was the first film to feature contemporary hunger in Ireland. Now, there's just a few slides left at this stage. Another syndicated article by Jean Cohen, an NEA service writer, was based on an interview with 3 young Irish immigrants, and the article included their photographs. Cohen's reportage was published across North America in locations as distant as Ontario, Kansas, New Jersey, Hawaii, but lots of other places, beneath emotive titles such as Refugee Lads and Colleen Smile Cheerily, and you can see the various different headings there as they're shown. References to the fact that there is a famine and to the fact that the children are refugees. So the image appears with a caption, and the caption says, "Refugees from famine-stricken Ireland are flocking to America." Among them were Sarah and Delia Craven, left to right, and insert Joseph Coyne. Coyne travelled from Clifton to New York, and he described Connemara as bad enough when things are good. Could you imagine somebody saying that? Of course you could. We could say it about many things. It doesn't relate just to Connemara. But the shortage of turf and potatoes, he said, were a fight for mere existence. Delia Craven from Galway, no better described than from Galway, I don't know whether it's the county or the city, claimed that the young folks were leaving and that it was hard to get old folks away, even when hunger and sickness comes. Now, there was one other group of people who were fascinated by the famine. And the famine held great fascination for the communists for very obvious reasons. And following Jim Larkin's release from prison in America and his time in the Soviet Union, he was ready to use the 1925 food supply crisis to propel his leadership of communism in Ireland, as he had promised the Soviets. Jim Larkin, however, was neither good at keeping his promises nor a team player, both important requirements if the food supply crisis was to mobilize communist political fortunes in Ireland. And he was joined by Bob Stewart and Helen Crawford from the Communist Party of Great Britain, who began work in the west of Ireland, having formed a Workers' International Relief branch in Dublin. And they were responsible for some of the English scare in newspapers that De Valera was so exercised about. And that's why I'm just showing you those people, because they are effectively behind this. Behind what? Well, the left-leaning Daily Herald in London was undoubtedly the English newspaper De Valera had in mind. This article refers to a county councillor in Clare claiming that people were eating pigs' food. Now, I've yet had time to check this out. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it certainly merits some examination to see is it true and what the context was, and was the context fairly reported. But during one fortnight in February alone, Daily Herald headings included eating pigs' food, Irish famine plight, living like rats, Irish famine a fact, and hungry Irish barns, a reference to children in Scotland, mainly. This is the second last slide. The newspapers carried Workers' International Relief advertisements framed around the question, workers of Britain, what are you going to do on behalf of your Irish brothers? This advertisement on the 23rd of February 1925 acknowledged a £60 donation from German workers and urged British Labour Party and trade union members to agitate and support for the cause. And a remarkable final slide. A Pravda article, headlined Famine in Ireland, denounced Archbishop O'Donnell's denial of famine. The article included a line drawing of an apparently well-fed O'Donnell, depicted alongside an Irish peasant's cabin showing 3 hungry, dejected figures without food. The author accused the Irish Free State government of being in cahoots with the imperial government in London and claimed, among a lot of other things, that 75,000 peasants were starving in Ireland. Finally, he hoped for the arrival at Dublin of a red ship under the red banner, which he believed would be of great support and political significance. The author was Jim Parkin. And that essentially is it. But I must thank the Society here for hosting the talk, for the interest that you have in it as an audience, and for the privilege that it is to dip into the PhD stuff that I'm doing and pick out some of the things that may have local interest and show them to people in a local society dealing with heritage who might value them. So thank you.
Oh my goodness, that was absolutely fascinating, Noel. I think I speak for everybody when I say that. Noel, I have a little something for you.
Oh, yes.
To express our gratitude to you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
My greatest demand at the moment is for the bottle of water. And I was just about 10 minutes into it and I realized, of course, the bottle of water is in that bag over there. So, you know. Well, yes, but it would take a good few nods to get across the idea. Do you know? Lovely. Thanks very much. Thank you. I'm very happy to do it. So, and if you have any questions that I can answer, I will. And if I don't.
But I might have a look on the just on this to see if there's any questions. Paul, you might help me out there and let me know if there's any questions on the comments.
I don't think so.
Okay. And if there's anybody who's joining us online who's any questions, they might have a think about them now. You can let me know if there's anybody on that side.
Okay.
On the floor here?
No.
Just to repeat the question.
I will.
Yes.
Just on the interviews or how they got their information from the teacher of Connemara, when I see Mullen and places like that, there must be some translator, I expect.
Okay. Yes, this is about how are the interviews obtained, and is there a translator, especially in places like Lettermullen, where obviously in 1898 for certain it was exclusively Irish that anybody would hear coming to there. Well, James Long from the Manchester Guardian spoke extensively about his sources, and he used the local poor law guardians, he used the local relief officers, but the most important people he was using were the priests. And in terms of the 1898 photography, I would think that the priests were heavily involved in it, because James Long was unable to get a photograph of the people on the relief works. Remember the photograph I showed you from the sketch? These men were in the distance. There were no women. He said women wouldn't even come close to the camera. He was on his own. He didn't have a parish priest with him who might arrange, ensure, or somehow questionably marshal somebody's appearance if it came down to it. So from that point of view, I would say that there was a couple of records of people being over from British newspapers seeking to get photographs and interviews and being able to get none, because people understandably, and in fact people reasonably, wouldn't talk to them, and you wouldn't do it today either, you know. So I would think the majority of them were mediated by priests, and Father Lavelle, to whom I referred, was offering people in the United States the possibility that he would be able to give them photographs of children that were in need. You know, so the priests were involved in it substantially. And finally, in 1898, if you look at the Manchester Guardian pages from about November of 1897, right through until the end of June and early July, dozens of priests from right across Connemara, Kerry and Donegal, I mean, high dozens of them, maybe 65, 70 of them, are writing over and back to the columns of the Manchester Guardian, expressing gratitude for stuff that has already arrived and explaining the need for yet more to come. So the priests were certainly involved in it, yeah.
I understand this emphasis on distress rather than famine by both the government and the Republic. Was it shame or image over the new state not being able to look after itself?
No, the new state. Oh, sorry. The point here was, where did the term distress come from, and why was famine not really used, and why did the government effectively use the term distress and prefer it over famine? Well, first thing to say about it is the government were doing what the governments before them had done, what the Dublin Castle governments had done. And the government was right in doing it because famine is generally emotive in most countries. Famine is deeply emotive for very obvious reasons in Ireland. Probably, my children are in their 20s. There are probably ways about how they act and think today that were even shaped by that famine. It is so profound, and we're quite a distance away from it at this stage. So, British administrations definitively refused to use the term famine. The Department of Agriculture is established in the beginning of 1900, and by the time they get to 1922, when it's becoming under the local government or the Dublin government, you will find they haven't simply used the word famine. It just wasn't in their lexicon. The term is distress, and it's well defined. What is it defined as? Distress has nothing really to do with poverty, in that when you are dealing with distress, you are not dealing with poverty, you are dealing with some temporary great deterioration of circumstances way beyond what you might call poverty, where you would need to feed people to prevent them from starving. And all of these relief works in the 1890s, of which there were 3 years in which they were used, effectively did that. There were bad harvests, but nobody died. And the reason nobody died was they were fed, if you like, almost just to the point of starvation. So politically, famine was a difficult term, and very significantly, and finally, to answer the question, when the provisional government is only 6 weeks old and the letter comes, and the Dáil is setting up the first £100,000 for the distress. W.T. Cosgrave, an inexperienced minister, they were all inexperienced, refers to it being distress and famine, near famine in some cases. There is no way W.T. Cosgrave would have ever said anything remotely like that ever again. It was possible to say it 6 weeks into a new government because, of course, you could point to the causes of such a famine to the previous administration. But for a government that's fighting literally, politically, and just after fighting militarily for its life in 1925, there are various things you are not going to concede. And one of them is that the country cannot feed itself. And Archbishop O'Donnell filling in behind the government on that was a profoundly significant move on his part. Remember, he had his, well, not remember, I didn't know until I came looking at it myself now, in fairness, but his home place was burned because of his attitude and the church attitude against the irregulars during the Civil War. So this man is heavily invested in the security, in the survival of the new state. So that's it. That you could call it whatever you liked. You could not call this phenomenon famine. Yeah. Okay, Johnny. Yeah.
No, well done. That's a very responsive and very interesting and very well researched. Did you come across anything in your research on the role of the Congested Districts Board?
Yes. So this is a question. Sorry.
Especially between the difference between 1898 and the 1920s, because the Congested District Board was, I think, disbanded in 1923.
Yes.
I think.
Yes, it was. And this question is about the Congested District Board, the difference that it might have made between 1898 and 1923 when it was disbanded. Remarkably, Archbishop O'Donnell is a member of the board of the Congested District Board. Not only is he a member of the board, he's a member of the first board right through to the last board. So he, when he's making this statement, is profoundly knowledgeable about this, quite apart about the intricacies of how this works. So did the Congested Districts Board make a difference? Yes, it did, very substantially. If you look at the 1890s, obviously towards the end of the 1890s, not in the early 1890s because it's not established and up and running and going, but when you look at it in 1898, one of the interesting things about it was I was looking at what were they doing about potato blight? Because in 1898, it is known that bluestone or copper sulfate will, with Bordeaux mixture, and will prevent potato blight. And it was very interesting to see that when there was a bad year, typically what would happen is when there was a bad year, practitioners, farmers, people who are growing potatoes would spray and be very vigilant the year after it. They tended not to be so much in other years. It was actually very interesting to look at the spending of the Congested District Boards on potato spraying initiatives. They actually had to, just like the growers of the potatoes, they had to learn this lesson every time as well. They weren't very good at it. But yes, they did make a difference, and very significantly. While there were 3 serious enough food supply crises in the 1890s, of which the 1898 one was worst. While there were 3 then, there was one in 1905, one in 1907, and they were very mild. And part of the reason why they were very mild was by that time, the work of the Congested District Board is making a qualitative difference in that. Now, other things are happening as well. People are even less reliant on potatoes than they were. You know, potato varieties are getting better, spraying techniques are getting better, or whatever. The food supply crisis in 1922 had little or nothing to do with potato blight. It was an economic collapse, essentially. And again, the one in 1925 was much more about the heavy rainfall. So what happened was in 1924, there was excessively high levels of rain. Now, I haven't gone looking at the Met Éireann records. It would be a useful thing to do at some point, but it's not within, 1925 is not within my PhD. I'm just doing this as an interesting topic outside it because the centenary is next year. And excuse me, I did want to look at it. But yes, the Congested District Board was among things that made such a difference that there were these profound problems in the 1890s, and they weren't there in the 1900s in anything like those amounts. So it did make a difference. Okay.
just that back from 1890s to the 20s, 9 of my father's family they're from North Connemara, Carolan, immigrated to the States. There's just one family, there's 23 of them in the family.
Yeah.
A few of them and my father immigrated for a short while in 1927, just in time for the Great Depression in America. Like there was 6 of them alone in New York at the time. But I asked them once, I said, how come there were so many of you? My grandmother must have had enough time, and we lost, and we were really only made for export. As they got, and they sent money back to help the others. But that thing of the debts decreased in Connemara. The main reason for that was immigration.
Yes.
It was a massive. When you think there was 9 people from one family, it's easy to see. And in South Connemara and Corunna and Carolan around there, it was just massive wipeout of the population. But most of them that survived immigration.
Yeah, so this question or point is more around the emigration of people, the extent to which in your family 9 out of that family had emigrated, and that there were 6 in New York at one stage at one point in time, and the fact that the emigration would have caused some of the reduction in the deaths. Yes, this is the emigration levels were extraordinary. Very much, like I'm very conscious of it. I grew up and lived on and have done my family history on the east coast of Ireland. And the levels of emigration that there were from County Meath were significant, but not in any way comparable to what's happening right across from Donegal, right down to kind of Kerry and right into West Cork. However, I'm not so sure that the difference on the deaths in 1925 in Galway overall being only 11, difference of 11. I'm not so sure that emigration would have an awful lot of impact on what happened in just those 12 months for a couple of reasons. First of all, the people who emigrate are rarely the type of person who is likely to die from starvation. You can't emigrate if you don't have the money to go. You know, like so you would. I don't think that there would have been a situation that sufficient numbers either could have gone in that 12-month period just to, if you like, prevent a series of deaths that would otherwise have happened. I think it is likely that the death levels weren't terribly different one year compared to the other, 1925 and 1924. Like I was astounded when I saw the figures, because I only looked at the figures months after I had done the research. And I kind of thought, well, you know, don't have to look at the figures. And when I looked at the figures, I was just extraordinarily surprised that there was so few. First of all, there were 1,500 less on the national level. And that when you looked at Galway, there was only less than a dozen as it happened in the difference. So the emigration certainly was extraordinarily high, but the relationship between the emigration and the levels of deaths is, in the short term, like to compare one year against another year, probably isn't that significant, because I haven't looked at it, but the likelihood is that broadly similar proportions of people left in 24 as they did in 25, as they did in 26. You know, that there wasn't a war that stopped them going or whatever on those 3 years as it happened. So it's difficult to know what impact it would have had on it. Any other questions or points?
I have a question about the photographs from 1898.
Yes.
Why were they staged? Is part one of the question. I mean, purely if they went into a very poor, small house, they'd have seen, you know, they're having staged them. And the second part of it is, I don't know what everybody else thought, but it didn't look to me like the people were starving. The clothes were very poor and the circumstances were poor. But I couldn't see how people could tell from the photographs people who were starving. You know, the faces were full. I mean, we've seen photographs of starving people from other countries going on currently. And, you know, the very thin limbs and swollen bellies and so on. I'm just wondering why did it seem to be such strong evidence of starvation?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting point, because there's a lot of things in that particular question, which is essentially asking, how is it that why was there a need to stage the photographs? Could you not see with the camera basically what was happening, so to speak, and they were staged? And the second part of the question is around the fact that, like, when you look at the photographs, they don't, on the face of it, pun not intended, look as if people are starving. So what do I think about it generally? So first of all, when I say staged, that it's arranged in this sense. First of all, there are hundreds of photographs in that phone that I've taken of my family and everything else around the place. They're all staged. You know, we do, like, if you're going to take the most staged photograph that anybody has typically is the wedding. The wedding photograph is an absolute masterful exposition of the notion of staging something. So the first thing about it is almost every photograph is staged. Almost every photograph that was ever taken in any set of conditions is even staged. So, like, those children were made to appear downhearted and suggestive. So why would you do it? Well, let's think of even an example like this. You walk into the house or room and you're going to photograph the children in it, for example. Now, there's all kinds of ethical issues. You wouldn't do it today. There were ethical issues then, but they weren't considered. These people were never, they didn't give any permissions, I am certain, for these photographs. They would never have been sought. The class differential between the photographer and the people who are reading these films, these material, is huge. Remember, like, it's extraordinary. So the point is, if we went in to photograph the children in 1898 or in 2008, and if you wanted to represent the fact that they're hungry and poor, if you go in and the children are giggling and playing, for example, well, you'll ask them to stop. You're staging it. Do you know what I mean? You're already managing it at that point. So they are heavily staged. So what they did with them was photographs of women generally showed a child in their arms. Generally showed a child in their arms, and you'd let the feet protrude. They were generally barefooted anyhow, but this is how you convey that it's a child and it's not a bundle of blankets. There was one photograph in which a woman stood up, and she was photographed standing like that, which I presume is an indication that in her instance she was pregnant, because Madonna-like photographs and images. I don't have a background or no background in photography, but it would seem that that's what the story that was there, because she was in a household in which there were lots of children, and the presumption was that the viewer, like, you have to remember, the photographs are taken for the viewers, so you want them to look a certain way. It's still true today. If you're going to take a photograph of a child in the famine district, there is a premium on a photograph, for example, where a child has a fly in its eye, as opposed to one that doesn't have a fly in its eye. So, like, this isn't something of just then or now. It's always in terms of how you present something. So that's that point. The next point then about they didn't look like they were starving. Starving depends on what you determine to be starving, really. Was there anybody at the general point where they were likely to die as a result of not having food? Almost no. Were people malnourished? Yes. Because malnourishment isn't necessarily a function of the quantity of food you can have. You can quite a lot of food and people malnourished. So I don't think that, and the politics around it were huge. Like in 1898, for example, the United Irish League is starting up in Mayo, and Michael Davitt is making the point that people are starving, that it's like 1847 again. It wasn't like 1847 again, you know. So it becomes terribly, terribly emotively invested by the people who have different views of it, as many things are today. If you look at something around immigration, asylum, all of these topics of today, they are hugely politically emotive, and you can see it in the discourse around it, you can see it in the photography around it, and that's what you're seeing when you're looking at these. But those children didn't. Like, I was struck when I saw the photograph of Delia and her sister, whose name I can't remember. I think, sorry, don't take those. I can't remember where they're sisters, so don't think of them as sisters. If you need to find out anything about them, I'll get you the article if you need to see, if you want to see it. I have a sneaking suspicion they might have been sisters. But anyway, when I saw those photographs, what was the first thing I thought of? They don't look that hungry. Why? Because you've been forced to connect that these were, look at the headings, the things that were in those 4 headings, they all typically had the word refugees, famine. Any variety of mix of those words is what gave it those 4 or 5 headings that I used there. So it's deeply emotive stuff. And about the photographer, finally then, first of all, why did the Irish Field take the photographs over there? Remember, who are reading this? The people who are reading this are living a very different lifestyle. Yachting, fishing, hunting, shooting, bicycling. Cycling was a big thing in the 1890s, huge thing. Motoring. Those people are living in another universe in comparison to what was here. So the question that really has to be asked, and I couldn't answer for quite a while, was, what is the Irish Field doing over in the west of Ireland, talking about a famine to a crowd of its readers who generally are interested only in going to Connemara in the fishing season or shooting season, but they don't want to hear very much else about what's happening? Why were they over there? Well, the reason why they were over there, as far as I can find out, is Frederick Faber McCabe was A, doctor, B, the owner of and the editor of the Irish Field, C, when that happened, in grave trouble. Why was he in grave trouble? Because he was being hauled up and down the courts, because he had made and given some undertaking in the Irish Field about the values of shares. He was caught up in what we would call today insider trading. And there were several court cases with it. My hypothesis or view about it is because I don't think he was motivated by it from a humanitarian point of view, because he wrote most of the articles. He was a doctor. A doctor should have something very significantly better to add to his or her, there weren't many female doctors writing at the time. He never mentioned any aspect of his medical side. I think he was there for one reason only. He wanted, like, it was generally something positive to be doing. He was a nationalist and all of that. But predominantly, my view is that he expected to get a boost in circulation for the Irish Field because he was in financial trouble, because a year later, he was not the owner of the Irish Field. Also, if you're being hauled up and down the forts and you're having an image problem, today, if you got the benefit of a PR consultant, she or he would tell you, well, you know, do something for charity might be a good move. Perhaps that was his motivation either. But it's very significant. The question really is, I couldn't figure this out for ages, and very little, I can't find a photograph of McCabe, can find very little information about him. It seems that he was fascinated, he was fabulously into horse racing, which is why he was involved in that magazine. He was also athletic as well. He was an athlete of some significance, but I can find out nothing about him afterwards. And that was that. Yeah.
What was the impact of all the rain the year before not being able to save the turf? Everybody would have needed turf for cooking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so while there might have been a shortage of potatoes or whatever, was the lack of proper fuel a major?
Yes. 1925, unlike all of the others, was not singularly and solely about food. It was in the newspapers represented as, and in the official documents of the day, very much the case that it was as they were saying, a famine in terms of food and a famine in terms of fuel. So what it seems happened was that there was exceedingly heavy rain. It must have been early enough, indeed, in the growing season for the potatoes. I'd imagine it must have been kind of July or August rather than October or November, because it very significantly affected the potato crop. There's actually less talk about blight than I thought might have been about it. It does seem to be a rain damage issue for the potato crop. And the issue then with the turf obviously was that turf couldn't be saved because of the levels of water. Probably, like if it was part of the PhD, one of the things I would definitely have to look at would be to look at the Meta-Éireann records and see, you know, how different was it, and also was there a spatial difference to it? Like, you know, like was Donegal, Kerry, and Connemara, for example, a lot worse than other places normally in a year, you know. So it does seem that a very significant issue was the lack of cooking capacity because people hadn't turf. Now, the other thing you have to remember of the turf is turf, at the end of the day, coal is an alternative to turf, but the economy is absolutely shattered in 1925. You know, the government is actually shattered as well from the cost of the Civil War and all the rest of it. Like it was, like these were awful times. Awful things had happened. The weather was only one of the awful things that had happened, you know.
I don't think most people in West Ireland would have brought forward.
Oh, none at all. No, no.
They wouldn't be able to afford it. I mean, you know, turf was whatever.
Oh yeah, turf was.
What we all.
Yeah, turf was the mainstay.
No timber.
No, Tim.
No.
That's on the West of Ireland. And as far as I know, there was an embargo after the founding of the state by the British and then imports of or exports of coal from England to Ireland. During that time.
No, I don't know that there was a ban on it. But
It certainly was that later on in the war years.
Oh yeah. Oh
yes.
Yes. Oh yes.
But they were reluctant to give us any help of any description.
Yes.
Because of the way we got our independence. So,
Yeah. Well, there were elements of that in it, but certainly during the emergency in the Second World War, many Dubliners for the first time saw turf, and they saw it in the Phoenix Park because it was being stored in the Phoenix Park at the time.
we came from Galway too.
I would think, so, yeah, in the Midlands too, yeah. But there's no doubt that the turf was the mainstay for cooking. But if put it this way, the early 1920s was a much more difficult year, a much more difficult period to be looking for an alternative to turf than it might have been in the 1890s, because the economy was so shattered and coal was very expensive.
I think turf was also used by a lot of people to sell,
Yes,
to get a few pounds.
yes,
Certain people would have been able to sell it,
yes.
and that was a huge impact in the war.
The other,
The Iron Islands built entirely on truck from Connemara. I'm saying years later with the gas. If there was a lack of truck in Connemara, the Iron Islands were desperate for heat.
yeah, well, the Aran Islands had a problem because they had no turf, like
No,
they had no turf. So like whatever about Ireland having no coal, to be in an area as desolate as the Aran Islands and have no turf was a really serious issue, you know, and that was the delivery of coal that Bronner was talking about there to the Aran Islands. That was more significant, and the papers do talk, and the newspapers talk about that the Aran Islanders were unable to secure the quantities of turf that they would normally secure from the mainland because of the shortage. I have a question though. I have a question eventually after all of it, is this. When I come, because I'm very conscious of this, I'm very conscious of the fact that for years and decades, there has been no shortage of experts, officials, inspectors, and all kinds of other Dublin types of people coming to the west of Ireland and Connemara, telling them what they should or shouldn't do and what's best for them and all the rest of it. So, and I don't want to be with that gang, so to speak. But what I'm asking you essentially is this. When you see the material that was presented there, what do you think of it? Like, do you think it was fairly represented or not? Or in terms of the photographs and in terms of the way it was treated?
You mean from you, the Dublin person?
No, I don't mean from me personally. No, I don't mean from me personally, Jason, no, we're not into that. No, I don't mean from me personally, but what I mean is when you see the representations that, like my view essentially, I suppose, is this. There was a very politicized view of the west of Ireland and Connemara. For a lot of people, whether it was J.M. Singh or whether it was Roger Casement, for example, people who saw them as almost an elite type of people who were the closest to God, who were the purest kind of Irish people, because of course they spoke Irish, which they were, you know. And so I often wonder to what extent people really understand, coming from outside, how different these areas are. And like there's the one thing I'm certain about is you can't, and you probably couldn't do it today or anywhere else either, drive through a place and in the matter of a few hours and a few interviews or whatever, come out of it and claim that you figured out how effectively they live over there and what their issue is and their problem is and whatever, you know.
But particularly in the language barrier.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, hugely, hugely. You know, the other final point about it, I suppose, is I'm convinced also, McCabe said in the articles, he was going to send he sent the photographer down to get more photographs. And he asked that he would get photographs of men with their arms and chests bare. Now, why did he ask for something like that? Because. In 1897, there were a series, and in many years earlier too, but there were a series of famine articles about famine in India. Famine in India was nothing like famine in Ireland. Famine in India, often in the 1890s, there were famines in India where there would be arguments about whether it was 3 million or 4 million or maybe 6 million that died. The numbers were just colossal. But you would see there were, and I'm convinced that McCabe had seen this photography, and the photography would show Indian people, obviously in loincloths, because many people dressed like that in the climate that it was anyhow, and you could see people who were absolutely exceedingly thin and apparently without food. And there is no doubt from reading the articles that McCabe had in mind that he was going to get something like this from Connemara. And Lennon told him that he was unable to get these photographs. And the reason I'm convinced that he was unable to get these photographs is that, firstly, it was an unreasonable thing to ask people to do. Secondly, it is absolutely understandable that they would not do it. The real problem is what was happening in India. Why were the Indians being photographed like this? Because largely the photographers, the English, they were British photographers, and they were British missionaries as well. But the class differential between British people and people on the west coast of Ireland, whom they saw as very primitive and lots of difficulties with them, but they are white. They are like us. The Indian people were not either white nor like us. And they were photographed there. I've read accounts of people, one photographer, is in 1865 or so, and he photographed he came to photograph people in evening light. Now, light would have been a bigger issue. The further back you go in photography, the more important light is, because the photography depends, the chemical system is not as good as it is as it goes along in time. So he came to photograph these people, 6 or 7 of them, and it was too dark to do it. And he came back the next morning and 3 or 4 of them were dead. What's the point? What ethical, massive ethical issues and issues about autonomy surely must and did arise. If somebody was so compromised by their hunger that they were within hours of their death, that somebody might be photographing, you know. So the point is, people in India could never happen to the autonomy to say no. People in the west of Ireland did, and they said no. And McCabe did not get the set of photographs that he wished. The piece that people wonder about looking at it is where the photographs real and did they take them inside and where the clothes regular and all the rest of it are understandable. But when you read the articles, the bit that's even more extraordinary is the type of photographs the man thought he was going to get, as opposed to what was actually got even, you know. So, yeah, it was, like most people would have had huge problems with it, you know. So deeply political stuff, you know. But I'm not prepared to study it and not come out and say to people, listen, come here, look at this stuff. It's interesting. Yes, Johnny.
But I suggest that perhaps the main reason that people from the east of the country, you know, they're passing through and all that, and don't understand. But I suggest that the quality of the land would have to be a central issue in how America survived. And if you look at the photos that you have there, even you see these masses of stone walls and small bits of clay, you know, in between rocks sticking up or out, this sort of sports and all that. I think for anyone, everyone should see the amount of labour involved to get that amount of clay out of that amount of rock. And I think that might be something which people from the eastern side of Great Land, even us here, have difficulty in this part of the world.
Oh, yeah.
Visualizing the amount of labour that must have gone into the survival on that rock with tiny bits of clay.
Yeah, it was awful levels of labour intensity. And to use this kind of mad, twisted Churchillian kind of concept, but like you had so many people doing so much to eke so little out of such poor soil, really, you know.
Now, there was also, you know, the graziers were also active.
Oh, yeah.
In Connemara.
Yeah.
I think it all came to a head around between 1910 and 1915.
Yes.
So there was a lot of activity, cattle drives and all.
Oh, yeah, the ranch war.
Finally, in that
Might be, I mean, I'm not sure.
I think might have been the area.
Yeah.
There was a lot of activity.
Yeah.
So possibly the land was probably a bit better
Yeah.
there, but the graziers had taken the best of it as usual.
Yeah.
And people had to fight to get their share of it as well.
That was the most scandal in the land league. Very active.
I think it was further back, this particular one.
Yeah.
I think further back towards.
Yeah.
I think Tullycine was Tullycine is just. It might put it in trouble. That's not far back to the top of there.
It's just not far from the right.
No, I got on the.
You should turn right. That's what the Bradford was down and meets up with Tullycine.
But you know, you have Carolan.
Yeah.
It's really common Carolan.
Yeah. It's a parish plan.
One of the things though that comes out of that, Johnny, is Cormac O'Grady's work. We only really have one historian who's on the world stage. Cormac O'Grady is a world level historian of famine. But I remember reading a piece at one stage, which is very significant, that he had written. And this was when he was a young man, he was writing this in his 70s, and it was a small point, but it's important. So when you look at the average holding size for land after the famine, it begins to increase very substantially, because obviously during the famine, those that had least attachment to land are the greatest problems and the rest of it. But he was looking at some of the areas in Belmullet and in western parts of Mayo. I don't know whether he was looking at Galway at all, but in some areas there, he had found that after the famine, they bucked the national trend of the land holdings increasing in size. In other words, the problem that had been happening before the famine continued after the famine in those areas where land holdings were being split and were diminishing in size rather than significantly increasing in size. And there's a couple of things that kind of caused it, I think, and this is kind of classic man from Dublin looking at it type of thing, but I do think they were relevant. In a sense, they were almost artificial economies. And the reason why they were almost artificial economies is there were different things happening in them. The employment was largely with migrant labourers who were leaving and going to Britain, to England, Scotland, and coming back with money. There was money coming in from emigrant remittances from America. And in a sense, those two amounts of money coming into this place, oddly, allowed it to collapse even further in terms of the land holding size. It kind of, in many other places, that the economy and land was changing. Now, I know there were huge issues about the graziers, and the graziers were, like some of the graziers were shopkeepers, and the shopkeepers had a great amount of power. And, you know, there's no question that the graziers, did the graziers do well out of this? Absolutely, they had a field day. But I'm not so sure about, I think at the end of the day, there were things going on in the extreme west coast of Ireland, from Donegal right down to Kerry, in terms of the money that was coming in, both from people who were leaving. Like, that's not, this is not to denigrate, but it's not, put it this way, a successful economy or place can't surely be built on the concept that the men have to leave and go somewhere to work, and live somewhere where they're working, and leave the family at home, for example, or in a much more genderally equal place that one parent has to do it. Now, mind you, that's happening today in Dublin. If you go and see the numbers of Filipino nurses that are here or whatever, you know, this hasn't gone away, you know, as the saying goes. But I think in a sense, those kind of things, the money coming from men going to work away, and the emigrant remittances coming back in, almost enabled a kind of life to live in, I don't mean this in a negative way, but in a truly to live in a misery that was prolonged by virtue of this money coming in.
Yeah.
You know, like it was, it never, like the, you know, the notion of a virtuous cycle. This was a vicious cycle. It was getting worse rather than better. So, yeah, anyway, I found it all very interesting anyway. And I'm glad that you kind of found some of it interesting as well. Because the one thing that I'm certain of is, if you have public funding, as I have for studying, in my book, there is an absolute and profound responsibility, especially on someone like me, an old fella who's not going to be going out and doing a whole lot of work with it, academically, whatever. There is a profound responsibility to share the work with people, to get up off the chair and make the stuff relevant to people. Like, there's so many themes in that that are really important, you know, and like, anyway, but that's what I made of it anyway. So thanks for the interest in it.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any questions online, but I'll just double check to be sure. Any more questions online?
Okay.
I don't think so.
Oh,
Okay,
No.
so, no, we might end the meeting there. Thank you to everybody who joined us online. Thanks again to
Thank you.
Noel, and thanks to everybody who joined us here this evening. And we might have a cup of tea.